So I want to begin by finishing up this lecture we've been working on paradigms, theories, and social research. We've gone through the use of theory, and we've gone through some basic paradigms. But I want to finish this one up very briefly, and I'm not going to cover all of the slides in your PowerPoint, but I want to cover it very briefly by talking about some other kind of components of theory and how it's used. So let's do a quick review. We went over several perspectives. We went through rational choice, positivism or modernity, which I told you in class is not really a paradigm. It was something actually a little broader than a paradigm. Social Darwinism, structural functionalism, conflict, symbolic interactionism, phenomenology and ethnomethodology, feminist theory and critical race theory, the social construction of reality, or what Babby calls critical realism, and then postmodernism. Now, if any of those terms are unclear to you, you need to do a little bit of research. You need to do a little bit more reading. You need to be fluent in those theories and be comfortable talking about them and applying them. But at this point, we're going to move ahead and we're going to look at what Babby calls the elements of social theory. Once again, I'm not sure I agree with Babby's word choice, but what he's talking about here is that when we use the word theory, we really have two different meanings for it. First, is theory used as this broad thing, this very broad use of ideas that have been handed down and tested, these possible explanations in the very broadest sense. We use theory in research, that kind of level of meaning. We break this broad theory thing up into different perspectives or paradigms. I told you to think of those as sorting the different theories into groups, just like you sort laundry into different colors. Those perspectives then are bundles, groups of theories that share some very basic characteristics, especially what they focus on, and the set of assumptions that you should associate with each of those theories. Now, theories in this sense of the word, the way I'm using it now, theories are parts of paradigms. They're the things that you have sorted into those paradigm groups. They are the possible explanations. So once again, let's define theory at this level. And theory in this case is a proposed explanation of a behavior or phenomena that we see in society. It's based on observations and it's research, and it has been refined and developed over time. Now, theory also has a characteristic that's very important, and that's that it does not address just one instance or one behavior or one setting. Theory can be used to explain a lot of behavior in a lot of different settings at a lot of different times. Theory is robust, okay? But theories are more detailed than paradigms, right? We have all these different theories. They build up into these groups called paradigms, and then unfortunately, when we look at all of the paradigms, we call that theory. So I know that's confusing, but that's the way it is right now, okay? Now, we talked earlier about the difference between using theory in social sciences and the difference in using theory in natural sciences. And I want to remind you of what that difference is. And one of those big differences is that in the social sciences, remember we said that you kind of have those paradigm shifts. You have an explanation that makes sense and makes sense and makes sense until it doesn't make sense, and then it kind of gets thrown away and replaced with something new. Where in the social sciences, we have a theory that makes sense and then it kind of doesn't. We put it on the shelf, and instead of throwing it away and replacing it with something else, we just kind of recycle them. We pull them down off the shelf again, we tweak it a little bit, we refine it a little bit, and we tend to keep reusing the same kinds of theories and rebuilding on all of them. One of the reasons that that difference exists is because in the natural sciences, eventually you can achieve something called a law, something that is universal, something that is always going to be the case. Gravity is a law. There's not going to be situations where gravity doesn't apply. Now, there might be parts of space where the gravity is so minimal that it has very little effect, but that's okay. You can still measure it. That's what weight is, the amount of gravity that's being exerted upon that body. It's one way to define it, at least. In social sciences, we don't have laws. It would be really lovely if we did. It would make our work a whole lot easier, but it would make it a lot less interesting too. We don't have laws. There are no universals. There are things that are very common, but there are no universals. And because there's no universals, we can't just throw away a law or a theory. We have to try to refine it. And so those theories, once proposed, are always out there and are always potentially useful. Okay? Because we can't disprove a theory and throw it away, we have to rely very, very heavily on certain elements that allow us either to build the theory or to build the research, but more importantly, these items tend to allow us to link the theory with the research. One of the most important of those is variables. Variables are things that vary. It's as simple as that, things that vary. So for example, if I wanted, well, here's a great example. If I wanted to look at alcoholism, the effect of alcoholism on women, and I went out and I talked to 500 different women about how alcoholism was affecting their lives, I wouldn't sit down with one of them and say, "Oh, you're a woman, how wonderful," because they're all women. That's a constant. It doesn't vary. The thing that does vary is the effect of alcoholism on their lives. It varies. It's different from person to person. That's the variable. And that's what I'm interested in. So variables matter. There are two basic types of variables. Variable number one is the independent variable. Variable number two is the dependent variable. And I want you to think of them in that order. Independent is number one, dependent is number two. The independent variable is the variable that you believe might cause something. It's the one that you think comes first, right? If you're doing experimental research, it's the one that you would manipulate to do the research. Or if you're doing a more exploratory kind of research, it's the one that you're looking at first as assuming that it's going to cause what comes later, right? So the independent variable is the causal variable, or the one that the researcher indexes or manipulates. The outcome variable, the one that is caused by the independent variable, is the dependent variable. Dependent variable is dependent upon the independent variable. It's not dependent on anything. Dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. If independent variable wasn't there, you would assume the dependent variable wouldn't be either, right? So if I thought that my parents being divorced would cause the child to fail in school. The parent's divorce comes first. It's causal. It's not reliant on anything else, so it's the independent variable. The child's failing school was caused by the divorce. It came second. It depended on whether or not the parents got divorced. So that's the dependent variable, the outcome variable. Another thing that we need to consider briefly is kind of a set of characteristics of theories, or at least of how theories are applied to some sort of research question. And these are axioms, propositions, and hypotheses. Now, I'm not going to go through these in a lot of detail. If you want to read the slides, you're welcome to. I'm really only going to talk about two of them, and one of those is axioms, and the other is hypotheses. And we're going to talk about hypotheses in much more detail in a later lecture. An axiom, though, is the set of very small, almost trivial assumptions that we make when we apply or use a theory. So, for example, some of you have classes with Joseph Simpson. Joe and I have recently done some research, very basic kind of theory application, pretty robust statistical analysis, but we used social constructionism as a basic paradigm. We used a specific theory called religious plausibility structures. Now, this theory says that as capitalism has grown, religions have to operate kind of like businesses do, in that they have to recruit and maintain a customer base or a membership. And so they have to do a kind of marketing. And embedded in this process of marketing is setting up a series of explanations that match what people see in society and links it to their religious teachings in a way that makes sense and can continue to make sense despite social changes. Forgive me, Peter Berger, that's a very brief explanation of a really fascinating theory. But when Joe and I used that theory, we had to make some very basic assumptions. We were applying this to the question of whether or not people who had had a divorce would have different attitudes toward premarital sex, right? So axioms, those most basic, almost micro detail level assumptions that we were making, included things like people can change their minds about moral issues, right? If they couldn't change their minds, then getting a divorce wouldn't have any effect on the outcome variable. Another one was that religions have to have members, and they want to have members, and they're willing to change in order to have members, right? Very minor, very detailed, but sometimes axioms are where researchers trip themselves up. They assume something very small, build a whole lot on top of it, and they're not really aware of what it is that they're assuming. And someone else comes back and points out the flaw, and the whole wall comes tumbling down. The second thing I wanted to talk about briefly, as I said, is hypotheses. And as I mentioned, we're going to go over hypotheses in much greater detail later. But for right now, I want you to think of a hypothesis with a couple of very specific conditions. You probably already think of a hypothesis as a question or a guess, right? Wrong. A hypothesis is a prediction. It is not a question. It is a prediction, right? I hypothesize that if I throw this ball up, it will fall to the ground within the next 5 minutes. And I have to add that within the next 5 minutes thing, because the second part of the hypothesis is it is measurable. If I just say, if I throw this ball up, it will fall to the ground, how long am I going to wait for it? If it falls to the ground in 1,000 years, have I really proven my hypothesis, right? It has to be measurable. It has to be answerable. Does that make sense? So 2 criteria. It's a prediction and it's measurable. So I'll see you in a few minutes with the second video.